First report. Story of a woman who survived Hurricane Katrina. It's been years since Katrina, but the sound of the wind never really left me. It's not like the soft breeze that dances through the trees on a quiet evening. It's sharp, violent, like something alive that wants to tear the world apart. Even now, when the nights are still and silent, I hear it. I hear the wind, and I feel the weight of everything I lost that night. I remember when they first announced the hurricane would make landfall. Everyone in the neighborhood talked about evacuating, but my mom, stubborn as she was, said we'd be fine. We've been through storms before, she told me. Her voice steady but hiding that edge of fear I was too young to notice. My brother Eli was only 9. He trusted her. I was 17, old enough to sense that something wasn't right, but still too young to argue. We boarded up the windows, made sure we had flashlights, water, batteries. It felt like we were preparing for a bad storm, not the end of everything. The air had that heavy, oppressive weight to it, the kind you feel before a thunderstorm, but multiplied by 1,000. Then, when the wind started picking up, we stayed huddled downstairs, away from the windows. The power went out by midnight, and that's when the wind started screaming. I'll never forget the sound. It wasn't just howling. It was a constant, deafening roar, like an unstoppable force was pushing against the house, determined to rip it apart. Every gust felt like it could shatter the walls, and eventually it did. The ceiling began to creak first, like a warning. My mom grabbed Eli and me, shouting over the wind that we needed to get to the attic. The floodwaters were coming, she said. I could see the panic in her eyes now, that raw, primal fear. I think she knew the house wouldn't hold. But I followed her because she was my mom, and I didn't know what else to do. We had just made it to the stairs when the first piece of the roof tore away. The whole house shook, and I remember the sickening crack of wood as if the house itself were crying out in pain. I grabbed my brother's hand and pulled him toward the attic. Mom was right behind us, her face pale as the wind slammed into the walls like a battering ram. We climbed the ladder to the attic, but something told my mom to go back down. She thought she'd forgotten something. Maybe a family photo or some vital piece of our lives we couldn't leave behind. She told me to keep going, to stay with Eli, and she'd be right back. She wasn't. I'll never know what she saw when she went back down those stairs because, just moments later, the entire roof ripped away. The wind roared even louder now, and the rain, God, the rain was coming down in torrents, like someone had ripped open the sky. The water was already ankle deep by the time I realized my mom wasn't coming back. Eli was screaming for her. He was only 9. He didn't understand what was happening. I tried to calm him down, but the fear in his voice, it still haunts me. He kept asking where Mom was. I didn't know what to say. Then the water started rising faster. We were trapped. The attic was supposed to be our safe place, but now it was a death trap. The floodwaters were creeping up, inch by inch, with nowhere for us to go. The water was ice cold. I felt the panic clawing at my chest, but I couldn't let Eli see it. I told him to stay calm, that Mom would be back, that everything would be okay. I lied. The house groaned, and the walls were bending now, the wind pushing everything to its breaking point. I couldn't hear my mom anymore, but I knew she was down there somewhere, maybe trapped, maybe fighting the rising water, maybe already. I tried not to think about it. I tried to keep my focus on Eli, to hold on to him as tightly as I could. But the water kept rising. Eventually, it reached our waists, and Eli's grip on my hand tightened. He was shaking, his little body trembling in the freezing water. I pulled him up onto a wooden beam, trying to keep him above the rising flood, but the water just kept coming. There was no stopping it. There was no escape. Then I heard it, a sound, a muffled scream, from below. It was my mom. I could hear her voice, but it was faint, drowning under the weight of the water. She was trapped somewhere down there, calling for us. The terror in her voice, it was like nothing I've ever heard. Pure desperation. and I couldn't do anything, couldn't save her. The water reached our chests. I was crying now, not because of the cold, not because of the wind or the rain, but because I knew I was losing them. My mom, my brother, and there was nothing I could do. I held on to Eli as tightly as I could, whispering that it would be okay, even though I knew it wouldn't. And then I felt him slip. I don't know how it happened. 1 second I had him. The next, the water surged, and his hand was gone. I screamed his name, reaching out in the darkness, but I couldn't find him. The water was up to my neck now, and I was thrashing, trying to stay afloat, but it was no use. He was gone. I heard him scream once, just once, and then silence. I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of the wind, the water closing over my head, the crushing weight of it all. Somehow I survived. Rescue teams found me clinging to a broken piece of the attic the next day. They never found Eli or my mom, but the wind is always with me. It's there in the back of my mind, a constant reminder. I survived, but the wind took them. And every night, when the world is quiet, I still hear it. The wind never stopped. It never will. Second story. Story of a teenager who survived Hurricane Michael. I don't talk about that night, not because I've forgotten, it's impossible to forget, but because the memory is like a wound that never quite heals. No matter how much time passes, I can still feel the weight of the water, the sting of the wind, and the sound of their voices calling my name, swallowed up by the storm. It was October 10th, 2018, Hurricane Michael. We knew it was coming for days, but no one ever really believes it'll be as bad as they say, right? My parents talked about evacuating, about getting out before things got ugly. But by the time we made the decision, it was too late. The roads were already jammed, and the rain had started pouring down like bullets from the sky. We thought we'd be okay. We lived in a 2-story house, after all. We'd been through storms before, and my dad always said, "The house can take it." We stocked up on food, water, flashlights, all the things you're supposed to do when a hurricane is coming. But it wasn't enough. The power went out before dinner, just like it always does in storms. We lit candles and sat around the living room, trying to keep each other calm. The wind was loud, but at first, it felt like a normal storm. Heavy rain, some gusts, nothing we couldn't handle. But then the water started creeping in. Slowly at first, through the cracks at the bottom of the doors, through the windowsills. My mom noticed it first and tried to block the gaps with towels, but the water kept coming, rising, faster than it should have. The ground floor was flooded in less than an hour. We watched helplessly as the water poured in, covering the furniture, swirling around our legs, soaking everything. My dad told us to move upstairs, that the second floor would be safe. I could see the fear in his eyes even as he tried to keep his voice calm. We grabbed what we could and ran up the stairs, but the water kept rising. By the time we made it to the second floor, it was up to our knees. My heart was pounding in my chest, and every time I looked at my parents, I could see the same panic mirrored in their faces. This wasn't like the other storms. This was different, deadly. It felt like we were sinking, like our house had turned into a ship that was going down, slowly swallowed by the ocean. We didn't have time to think, just react. My dad opened the window in the hallway, the one that faced the backyard, and yelled for us to climb out onto the roof. He said we'd be safer out there. I didn't argue, I just followed. The wind hit me like a wall as soon as I stepped outside. It was howling, vicious, pulling at my clothes, slamming into my body like it wanted to tear me off the roof. I fell to my knees, clinging to the shingles, trying to get my balance. The rain was coming down so hard it felt like it was slicing into my skin, and I could barely see 2 feet in front of me. My parents were shouting at each other, shouting at me, but the wind swallowed their voices. I couldn't make out what they were saying. The only thing I knew was that we had to stay on the roof, had to stay above the water. But the wind was so strong. I could feel it pulling at me, threatening to tear me away. My dad tried to reach for me, tried to pull me closer to him, but the gusts were too powerful. I couldn't see his face through the rain, just his hand, reaching out for me, fingers stretching but never quite touching. Then it happened. I don't know if it was a gust of wind or if he slipped, but 1 second my dad was there, and the next, he wasn't. The wind ripped him off the roof like he was nothing, like he was weightless. I heard him shout my name once before he was gone, just gone, taken by the storm. I screamed for him. My mom screamed for him too. She tried to stand, tried to look for him in the dark, but the wind was too strong. She couldn't keep her balance. And then, just like my dad, she was gone too, snatched away by the storm before I could even reach for her. I was alone. I lay flat on the roof, my body pressed against the cold, wet shingles, the wind tearing at me from every direction. My parents' voices were gone, swallowed by the storm, and all I could hear now was the wind. It howled like it was alive, like it was mocking me for surviving when it had taken them. The water was still rising below me, but I didn't care anymore. I closed my eyes, waiting for it to take me too. I thought maybe it would be easier that way, to let go, to let the storm have me like it had taken them. But it didn't. Somehow the water stopped rising before it reached the roof. And when the storm finally passed, I was still there, alone. The rescue crews found me the next day, curled up on the roof, soaking wet, shivering. I don't remember much of what happened after that. I just remember asking if they had found my parents. They hadn't. They never did. The storm took them and it never gave them back. Sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the wind. Not the soft kind that brushes through the trees, but the kind that rips your world apart. It's there, in the back of my mind, a constant reminder of what it took from me. I survived, but they didn't, and I'll never understand why. Third story, a survivor's account of Hurricane Harvey. I grew up in Texas. Hurricanes were part of the landscape, like the heat and the constant hum of air conditioners. We always knew the drill. Board the windows, pack the essentials, and wait it out. But Harvey was different. I didn't know how much different until the water came. At first, it was manageable. The rain came down in sheets, but we weren't in the direct path of the hurricane, or so we thought. We'll be fine, I told Sarah, my wife, who was 8 months pregnant with our first child. The weather reports said the worst of it would pass to the east. Our house was old, but it had survived more than one storm before. But it wasn't the wind that we should have feared. It was the water. In less than an hour, the street outside turned into a river. The backyard became a small lake, and then the water started creeping under the door. I tried to stay calm for Sarah, but I could feel the panic rising in my chest as the water rose around our ankles, then our knees. I moved fast, gathering towels, blankets, anything to block the doorways. It didn't matter. The water was coming in from everywhere. I could see it bubbling up through the cracks in the floor. The power went out next. That eerie silence after the hum of electricity stopped made everything feel worse. Just the sound of the rain, relentless, pounding against the windows, and the soft gurgle of water filling our home. When the water reached our waist, I realized the situation was worse than I had let myself believe. I led Sarah to the kitchen island, the only thing in the house high enough to stay dry. She was shaking, not from the cold, but from fear. I tried to reassure her, but the look on her face said she wasn't buying it. She wasn't the only one. Then I felt it, a slow, sickening shift beneath our feet. I thought I was imagining it at first, but no, the ground wasn't steady. The house creaked, groaned, and I could hear the sound of glass shattering in another room. The whole structure started to tilt. I grabbed Sarah's arm, steadying her as the kitchen floor slanted to the left. Dishes and pots clattered to the ground. Water sloshed around our knees now, rising fast. I could feel the foundation of the house giving way. And then it happened. The house moved. First, it was just a lurch, a brief, terrifying jolt like being on a ship in a storm. But then the movement continued, slowly at first, then more and more until the house wasn't just leaning, it was floating. I could hear the dull roar of rushing water beneath us, carrying the house like a piece of driftwood. I rushed to the window, looking outside to confirm what I feared. We were no longer grounded. The floodwaters had lifted the entire house, tearing it from its foundation, and now we were drifting. Slowly, like some surreal nightmare, our house bobbed and turned as if it were caught in the current of a river. The view outside was just a swirl of debris and darkness, illuminated only by the occasional flash of lightning. I couldn't tell where we were or how far we had gone. I only knew one thing: we were no longer in control. Sarah screamed behind me, clutching her stomach. Her face was pale, her breath shallow. "It's too soon," she gasped. "It's too soon, but it's happening." I froze. "The baby, our baby. Now?" "No, no, no," I muttered, rushing to her side. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not like this. We were floating, for God's sake. There was no hospital, no doctor, nothing. Just me, just my hands. I didn't have anything, no supplies, no medical knowledge. I didn't even know how to deliver a baby under normal circumstances, much less in the middle of a hurricane while our house drifted aimlessly through the floodwaters. I tried to keep it together. I had to, for her, for the baby. "We'll be okay," I lied, wiping sweat from my brow. "We're gonna get through this." The house jolted again, crashing into something. I heard more breaking glass, but I couldn't focus on that. Sarah was on her back, propped up on the kitchen island, breathing hard, her face contorted in pain. I can't do this," she whimpered. "You can," I said, even though I wasn't sure if either of us could. I grabbed some towels from the counter and tried to create a makeshift space, kneeling beside her, my hands shaking. I had never been more terrified in my life. The water was still rising, now chest high, and I could barely think over the sound of the house creaking, the wind howling outside, and Sarah's labored breathing. Time became a blur. The storm outside, the rising water, the panic. It all melted into a single, frantic rush. Sarah pushed, screaming through the pain, and I did the only thing I could. I held her, guided her, and prayed. Prayed like I never had before. And then I heard it. A cry. Not Sarah's. Not mine. A baby's cry. I stared down in disbelief. In the middle of this chaos, this nightmare, our child had been born. I held him in my trembling hands, his tiny body slick and red. He was breathing, alive. I wrapped him in a towel, trying to keep him warm, as Sarah collapsed back, exhausted, but alive. We were still floating, still trapped in this nightmare, but for a moment, everything else faded. In that moment, amidst the chaos, there was life. We drifted for what felt like hours, maybe days. The house eventually settled, coming to rest against some debris. The water receded slowly, painfully slowly, until we could finally step outside. Rescue came 2 days later. They found us huddled together, exhausted, but alive. Sarah, me, and our newborn son. A miracle born in the heart of the storm. Fourth story. A survivor's account of Hurricane Sandy. They always tell you to stay put during a hurricane. Shelter in place, they say. Wait it out. But sitting in my house that night, as the winds howled like something out of a nightmare, I couldn't do it. I couldn't just sit there while knowing my neighbors, Bill and Margaret, were all alone next door. They were in their 70s. Their health wasn't great, and the storm had gotten worse. Far worse than anyone had predicted. I had seen the news. I knew the flooding was coming, and fast. Couldn't let them drown. It was around midnight when the power cut out, and the silence that followed was unbearable. No hum of electricity, no lights, just the relentless roar of the wind outside and the creaking of trees straining under the force. Rain battered the windows so hard it sounded like rocks. I thought about calling for help, but I knew the lines were down. No one was coming for us. We were on our own. I grabbed a flashlight, threw on my raincoat, and headed out the door. The wind hit me like a wall, nearly knocking me off my feet. The air was thick with debris, branches, bits of shingles, pieces of God knows what, flying through the air like shrapnel. I ducked my head and pushed forward, making my way toward Bill and Margaret's house next door. By the time I got there, the water was already up to my ankles. That's when I realized how bad it was. It hadn't been raining long, but the storm surge had come fast. I waded through it, my heart pounding. I should have turned back then. I should have listened to the warning bells going off in my head, telling me that this was too dangerous. But I couldn't. Their front door was unlocked. I burst in, shouting their names, my voice barely audible over the wind. Bill was in the living room, holding Margaret's arm, helping her stand. They looked terrified, and for good reason. The water was already coming into the house, lapping at the bottom of their stairs. "We've got to go now," I shouted, trying to sound calm, but I could hear the panic in my own voice. Bill nodded, but Margaret hesitated. "We can't walk in this, we can't," she began, her voice trembling. She was right. The water was rising fast, and Margaret wasn't in any shape to walk through it. "Take the car," Bill said, his voice shaky. "It's in the garage." I didn't have a better idea, so we made our way through the flooding living room to the garage. The water was up to our knees by the time I got them into the car, a beat-up old sedan that had seen better days. I climbed into the driver's seat, my heart racing as the water outside rose past the windows. I turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. "Come on," I muttered, turning the key again, harder this time. The engine whined, but it wouldn't catch. "We're not getting out of here," Bill said from the back seat, his voice barely above a whisper. I ignored him. I had to. I tried again, but it was no use. The car was dead. Worse, the water was rising inside the car now, seeping in through the doors. It was up to our ankles, then our knees in what felt like seconds. Margaret started crying, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. Bill was trying to calm her, but I could hear the fear in his voice too. I fumbled with the door handle, but it wouldn't budge. The pressure of the water outside had sealed it shut. The windows were fogging up, and my flashlight beam bounced off the glass, making it impossible to see what was going on outside. I was trapped, and I knew it. "Get us out," Bill yelled from the back, his voice cracking with desperation. I threw my shoulder into the door, trying to force it open, but it didn't move. The water was up to my chest now, freezing cold, making it hard to think, hard to breathe. I felt around for something, anything, to break the window. My fingers closed around a tire iron under the seat, and I swung it hard against the window. Nothing. I swung again, harder this time, but the glass just spiderwebbed, refusing to break. The water was up to our necks now. Margaret was screaming, gasping for air between sobs, and Bill was shouting, but I couldn't hear what he was saying anymore. The sound of the water rushing in, the roar of the storm outside, it drowned everything out. I don't know how it happened, but at some point, I just stopped. Stopped swinging, stopped trying. My arms were numb, my mind blank. The cold had seeped into my bones, and all I could think was, I'm not getting out of here. This is how it ends. But then, somehow, I don't know how, the window gave. The crack split open and water poured in, flooding the car even faster. I don't remember how I got out. If I kicked, if I swam, but I found myself outside the car, gulping for air in the freezing water. The current pulled at me, trying to drag me under, but I fought it, barely able to keep my head above the surface. I turned back toward the car. Bill and Margaret were still inside, pounding on the glass, their faces pale in the dim light from my flashlight. I tried to swim back, tried to grab the door, but the current was too strong. It pushed me away, further and further, until I couldn't see them anymore. Their screams mixed with the sound of the storm, and then nothing. I don't remember how I made it back home. I don't remember much after that, just flashes of the water, the wind, the cold. When I finally got back inside, soaked and shivering, I collapsed on the floor. The silence was deafening. No wind, no rain, just nothing. They found Bill and Margaret's car 2 days later, buried under debris. Their bodies were still inside, trapped, just like I left them. I should have stayed home that night. I should have listened to the warnings, should have known better. But I didn't. And now, every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. I hear their screams. And I know I'll carry that with me for the rest of my life. Fifth story. A survivor's account of Hurricane Andrew. They always tell you to prepare for the worst. Stock up on supplies, fortify your home, make sure you have a plan. I thought I had done all of that. I built our storm shelter with my own hands, right in the backyard, confident that it would keep us safe. I didn't trust the government shelters. Too many people, too much chaos. Here I thought we'd be secure. But when Hurricane Andrew hit, I realized I had made the worst mistake of my life. The winds were screaming outside, slamming into the house like a freight train. I could feel the ground trembling beneath my feet, and I was thankful we had made it to the shelter just in time. It was small but solid, reinforced wood, thick steel door, sealed tight against the elements. My wife, Laura, sat in the corner clutching our 2 kids, Emma and Jake. The kids were terrified, their little faces pale, eyes wide as they listened to the storm rage above. I had never seen them so quiet before. "How long do you think it'll last?" Laura whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I don't know," I replied, trying to sound calm, though my heart was pounding in my chest. "A few hours, maybe. We'll be safe here. This place is built to hold." I wanted to believe that. I needed to, but something was gnawing at me, a feeling deep in my gut that something was wrong. I told myself it was just nerves, that everyone gets scared during storms like this. But as the minutes dragged on, the air in the shelter seemed to grow heavier, thicker. At first, I thought it was just the anxiety, the claustrophobia of being trapped in such a small, windowless space. The sound of the wind battering the door was relentless, and the wooden beams groaned as if the storm was trying to rip us apart. I tried to focus on anything else, my mind jumping from one irrational fear to another. But then Emma said something that made my blood run cold. "Daddy, I can't breathe." I turned to look at her. Her small chest was rising and falling quickly, eyes watering as she gasped for air. Laura tried to calm her, but I could see the panic spreading. Jake, who had been silent for most of the ordeal, began coughing, his face flushed. My own breath felt shallow, labored, as if the air itself had thickened, turned to glue in my lungs. I could feel it now, the staleness, the lack of circulation. In my desperation to seal us away from the storm, I had forgotten the most basic necessity: oxygen. I rushed to the door, fumbling with the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I hadn't anticipated this. I had locked us in so tightly, thinking we needed protection from the outside, that I had trapped us with no way out. "Jim, what's happening?" Laura's voice was tight with fear. She clutched Emma closer as Jake slumped beside her, his breathing shallow, his eyes fluttering. My heart pounded in my ears as I banged on the door, screaming at the wind outside, but the storm drowned out my cries. The air was getting thinner, each breath harder than the last. Sweat poured down my face, and a dizziness crept in as if the world was spinning out of control. I don't know, I stammered, but I knew exactly what was happening. I had sealed us into this coffin, thinking I was protecting my family. But the storm wasn't going to kill us. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. Laura's face was pale, her lips trembling as she tried to stay calm for the kids. But I could see the fear in her eyes. She was running out of air too. I could see it. We all were. "I can't breathe," she whispered, clutching her chest, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. I staggered back, my vision blurring. My children, my wife, everything was fading. The storm raged above, indifferent to the horror unfolding below. All I could think about was how I had failed them. I had built this shelter to protect them, and now it was a tomb. Just as my vision began to fade completely, there was a loud bang from above, a sound that didn't belong to the wind. I couldn't make sense of it, my mind foggy, lungs burning. Then light, a blinding, cold beam of light piercing through the darkness of the shelter. Voices, muffled at first, grew louder as the door was wrenched open, and fresh air rushed in like a flood. I collapsed to the ground, gasping, my chest heaving as I sucked in the sweet, life-saving oxygen. The rescue team had found us. They had been scouring the neighborhood, looking for survivors, and somehow, by some miracle, they had heard the faint banging from our shelter just in time. I remember being dragged out into the storm's aftermath, the chaos of rain and debris swirling around us as they pulled my family to safety. Laura was barely conscious, her face pale but alive. Emma and Jake were limp, but they were breathing, slowly coming to as the fresh air revived them. We had been seconds away from death. I could feel it. As we were taken to safety, I couldn't help but look back at the shelter, at the place I had built to save my family. It was still standing, untouched by the storm, but I knew it would never see us inside it again. That shelter wasn't our salvation. It was our grave, almost. We survived Hurricane Andrew, but I've never been able to shake the thought that, in trying to protect my family from the storm, I had nearly become the storm myself.